A few weeks ago, I came across a chart. It showed tobacco consumption among men across India, and almost every state at the top of the chart came from the Northeast. I remember staring at it for a while. Honestly, I was shocked. But at the same time, I wasn't surprised, because if you've grown up here, you've seen it. In schools, on streets, at bus stops, outside churches, quietly chewing, not smoking. Something you could hide, something no one talked about. By the way, welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, hi. Thanks for the conversations and insights on the last video. The one about why Naga musicians don't make it big. A lot of you shared experiences that stuck with me. And in a strange way, those conversations led me here. Because the more I thought about this chart, the more one thought kept coming back. Maybe this didn't spread because people didn't care. Maybe it spread because nobody warned us. Not properly, not early enough, not honestly. So this video isn't about blaming individuals. It's about understanding how this became normal and why this needs to stop now. Let's start at the beginning. That chart stayed with me longer than I expected. Because once the initial shock wore off, I started asking myself, why didn't this surprise me more? When you actually think about it, the data wasn't revealing something new. It was confirming something many of us have quietly lived and seen around for years. Across India, tobacco consumption among men is already high. But when you break it down by region, the pattern becomes uncomfortable. Several states from the Northeast consistently rank among the highest, especially when it comes to smokeless tobacco. Not just one state, not once, but again and again, across different surveys and years. And this isn't just about statistics, because behind every percentage is something familiar, a habit you've seen in classrooms, when hanging out with friends, during colony song practices, outside shops that sell it openly, cheaply, and without much resistance. What struck me wasn't just how high the numbers were. It was how quietly this had become normal. There were warning labels, there were policies, there were laws on paper. But somehow the message never really landed. And sitting there, looking at that chart, I kept thinking, if the data has been telling this story for years, why did it take this long for us to start asking questions? When you look beyond headlines and actually read the data, a few things become clear. Tobacco use in India is already widespread. But what stands out is how smokeless tobacco behaves differently from smoking. Nationally, smoking rates have slowly declined over the years. Smokeless tobacco hasn't followed the same pattern. And in the Northeast, that gap is even more visible. Multiple large surveys, conducted years apart, show the same trend. Several northeastern states consistently rank among the highest in the country when it comes to tobacco consumption among men. Not just overall use, but especially chewing forms like shikhar gutka, kaini, kakasada, pan masala, and tamul mixed with tobacco. This isn't a one-time spike, it's a pattern. What makes this more concerning is that these numbers haven't dropped as sharply as expected. Even after warning labels, regulations, and national tobacco control efforts, which raises an uncomfortable question. If policies exist, if the dangers are known, why does usage remain so high here? The data doesn't accuse anyone, but it does point towards something deeper, a combination of access, habit, silence, and normalization. And once you see that pattern, it becomes harder to pretend this is just a personal choice problem, Because when entire regions show the same behavior, it usually means something systemic is at play. To understand how this spread, we have to talk about something specific. Why smokeless tobacco is treated differently from smoking. Smoking is obvious. It smells, it's visible, it leaves evidence. Chewing kaini, kakasada, or shikarjada mix doesn't. There's no smoke, no lingering smell in the air, no obvious sign from a distance. You can sit in a classroom, stand in a crowd, walk past elders, teachers, even family, and no one would know. And that difference matters. Because when something isn't visible, it's easier to ignore, easier to normalize, easier to excuse. For a long time, smokeless tobacco didn't carry the same social weight as cigarettes or alcohol. It didn't feel like an addiction. It felt like a habit, something small, something manageable, something people believed they could stop anytime. But the data tells a different story. Smokeless tobacco is highly addictive, linked to oral cancers, gum disease, heart problems, and long-term health damage. Yet culturally, it was never framed with the same urgency. And that's part of the problem. Because when risk is quiet and harm is slow, it doesn't trigger alarm. It settles in. And once it settles in, it becomes very hard to question. This conversation becomes complicated when culture enters the picture, because chewing in many parts of the Northeast didn't begin with factories or packets. It existed long before that, in the form of tamul in parts of Mokokchung, bordering plains of Assam, and kwai in Meghalaya. For generations, it was social, ceremonial, part of hospitality, conversation, and custom. But what's important to understand is this. Traditional practices were never designed to be addictive industries. They weren't sold in bright packets, they weren't engineered for dependency, and they weren't marketed to teenagers. That shift happened later, as commercial smokeless tobacco products entered the market. They didn't replace culture. They attached themselves to it. The familiarity was already there. The habit already existed. All the industry had to do was take advantage, make it cheaper, stronger, and easier to access. Suddenly, chewing wasn't occasional or contextual anymore. It became constant. And when something commercial hides behind something cultural, it becomes very difficult to question, because criticism starts to feel like disrespect, even when the harm is real. That's where the line blurred. Not because culture failed us, but because commerce learned how to exploit what was already familiar. For many of us, this habit didn't arrive suddenly. We grew up around it. It was there in school corridors, in playground corners, or in family gatherings where uncles are openly mulayings, kakasada, or chewing tamul. Sometimes even people you respected. And when you're young, that matters, because at that age, you don't evaluate risk, you observe behavior. If something is everywhere and no one is openly questioning it, it starts to feel normal. Sometimes it even feels acceptable, or worse, a little cool, especially in places where smoking and drinking are strongly discouraged, not just socially, but morally. In many Christian and Orthodox communities across the Northeast, visible intoxicants come with judgment. Alcohol smells, cigarettes give you away. Chewing tobacco doesn't. It's quiet, easy to hide, easy to deny. So without anyone saying it out loud, a message forms: this is the safer option. Not safer for your health, just safer from getting caught. And that's how habits travel. Not through rebellion, but through adaptation. By the time the consequences become visible, the habit is already deeply rooted. When something becomes this widespread, it's no longer just about individual choices. It's about the systems around those choices. Because while chewing tobacco was becoming more common, education about it stayed vague. Warnings stayed small. Conversations stayed uncomfortable. In schools, substance abuse was often discussed, but usually in broad terms. Drugs, alcohol, smoking, smokeless tobacco rarely got the same attention. In homes, it was familiar enough not to raise alarms. In communities, it was visible enough to be normal, but invisible enough to avoid confrontation. Even policy responses struggled to keep up. Laws existed, warning labels existed, bans were announced, but enforcement was inconsistent, and education rarely explained why these products were dangerous, only that they were. So the message didn't stick, because when people don't understand risk, they learn to live around it. This wasn't a loud failure. There were no headlines, no turning points, just years of silence and habits filling that silence. One reason this habit survives for so long is because its consequences take time. There's no immediate alarm, no sudden collapse, no moment that forces you to stop. The damage happens slowly. Smokeless tobacco is strongly linked to oral cancers, gum disease, tooth loss, and long-term damage to the heart and digestive system. But these outcomes don't appear overnight. They arrive years later, often when the habit feels too familiar to question and too difficult to quit. By the time symptoms show up, many people have already been chewing for a decade or more. And even then, the warning signs are easy to ignore. A sore that doesn't heal, bleeding gums, pain that comes and goes, things that don't feel urgent until suddenly they are. What makes this harder is how little we talk about it. We see the warning labels so often that they turn into background noise. We hear the risks so vaguely that they feel distant. And because the damage is hidden inside the mouth, it doesn't trigger the same fear as something visible. Out of sight doesn't mean out of danger. It just means out of conversation. It's important to pause here and say this clearly. This isn't a Northeast only issue. Across India, smokeless tobacco use is widespread. Millions of people chew in different forms, under different names, in different regions. What makes the Northeast stand out isn't moral failure, it's exposure. Higher consumption, earlier adoption, and fewer conversations around it. In many ways, the Northeast reflects what happens when a product spreads faster than awareness. When regulation exists on paper, but education doesn't reach the ground. When habit outpaces warning. So this isn't about pointing fingers at a region. It's about recognizing patterns and understanding why certain communities carry more of the burden. Because if we treat this as someone else's problem, we miss the chance to stop it from becoming everyone's problem. And the lesson here applies far beyond one map, one product, or one region. By now, it should be clear that this didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one bad decision or one generation going wrong. It was familiarity, silence, and a system that reacted too late. For a long time, chewing tobacco felt harmless enough to ignore, easy enough to hide, common enough to accept. But the damage it causes isn't small and it isn't abstract. It shows up in hospital wards, in long treatments, in our lives that quietly altered. So when we say, this needs to stop now, it's not a slogan, it's a reminder that awareness has to come before habit, that education has to come before punishment, and that conversations have to come before consequences. If you're young and watching this, pause before you start. If you already chew, know that quitting isn't weakness, it's awareness catching up. And if you're someone who can influence schools, homes, or policies, don't stay silent. Because silence is what allowed this to spread, and breaking that silence is where change begins. Thanks for watching. If this video made you think, share it, talk about it, and maybe warn someone you care about. Because we didn't get warned, but we can do better now.